Why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Kendall Hunt Publishing. This interactive presentation on developing a contemporary course in sports ethics will examine strategies for embedding ethical reasoning into daily sports context, equipping students to translate classroom learning into real-world decision-making. Today's expert presenter is Dr. Alan Zaremba. Dr. Alan Zaremba has been a faculty member at Northeastern University since 1981. He holds a PhD from the University of Buffalo and is a two-time recipient of Northeastern's Excellence in Teaching Award. On top of that, he has received the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Dr. Zaremba is an author of several Kendall Hunt textbooks, including Speaking Professionally, Organizational Communication, Sports Communication, and his newest title, Sports Ethics, Challenges for Athletes and Management. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Alan. During the presentation, you can use the Q&A or chat functions to ask your questions. I'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and Alan will answer any questions at the end. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a copy in the next few days. At this time, I'm thrilled to introduce our presenter, Dr. Alan Zaremba. Hi, Alan. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you for that very kind introduction. As Nikki mentioned, I'm on the faculty at Northeastern University, and I've been here for quite some time, since 1981. Prior to Northeastern, I was at SUNY Fredonia. I taught there from 1976 to 1981. I developed a course in sports ethics for our department, and in addition, I taught essentially a special topics course in sports ethics for our honors program. And when I was teaching, and I often do, a course called Sports, Media, and Communication, I had a section that dealt with sports ethics. And as Nikki mentioned, I've recently published a book with Kendall Hunt called Sports Ethics, Challenges for Athletes in Management. So this is what I intend to talk about today. And again, I'll be glad to answer questions that you have at the end of the webinar. First, why should we bother teaching a course in sports ethics? What are the challenges that are inherent in teaching such a course? What do I think ought to be in the class? And lastly, what are the criteria for a companion text? In this regard, of course, it's a little bit dispassionate. It's a little bit difficult to be dispassionate about a book that you wrote yourself, but I'm going to identify things that I think ought to be in a book that is a companion text for the course. Okay, why study sports ethics? You know, over the holiday time, I was with my family, and my brother-in-law asked me, when I told him I was writing a book on sports ethics, he said, do those two words go together? Sports and ethics, they seem like an oxymoron. And sports ethics do go together. And I think there are several reasons why it's important to teach a course in sports ethics. The first reason is that while in all walks of life, whether or not you're in politics, business, or even in our world, the world of education, we face ethical challenges. However, in the sports world, these ethical challenges and ethical lapses can have tremendous ramifications because these are highlighted. Why are they highlighted? Well, sports coverage is omnipresent. There are dedicated networks like ESPN, ESPN2, ESPNU, the NBA channel. There are dedicated social media sites just for sports. Our conventional media, whether you access it online or you access it in traditional print form, has sections that are dedicated to sports. And then there are national holiday type events like the Super Bowl, the World Cup, March Madness, the Olympics, that even non-fans watch. So therefore, the exposure is great, and when there is an ethical lapse, it's magnified. And there's no shortage of ethical lapses. Just 2 weeks ago, or it was about a week and a half ago, the New England Patriots had an issue where two of their athletes were accused of domestic violence. You had an issue during the same week of a coach challenging and confronting a referee after a game. So, and there are many such, when Caitlin Clark came into the WNBA, she was she had a difficult time, and fans did not act morally and ethically in response to how she was treated. So there are frequent and recurring ethical incidents in sport contexts, and these ethical lapses have enduring ramifications. You take a school like the University of North Carolina that had the paper class scandal where student athletes were allegedly taking classes, but these classes did not really exist. And then you had the issue at Penn State University when a pedophile was affiliated with the football program, and issues with Michigan State University and sexual abuse. These have lingering effects. So it's not only a factor that there are many of them, there are effects, many ethical lapses, there are effects that linger when people make poor ethical decisions. And these lapses become part of the national and international discourse. What are some of the teaching challenges? And I think there are many. The first two bullets on this screen deal with heterogeneity. You have students who take this course with various academic backgrounds. You may have a student who knows something about philosophy and knows something about ethical principles, and other students who are just interested in sports. You have students who may be majoring in communication and others who are majoring in management. And yet you have students who might take the course with different expectations. Somebody might say, hey, I'm interested in sports. I think we'll just schmooze in this class. Others might assume that this is going to be a serious course that deals with ethics and philosophical principles. So you have different expectations. This heterogeneity can be good, but it's a challenge. This course requires the ability to express and explain foundational theories that can be complex. They are digestible. They can be presented in a way that makes it easy to digest them, but you have to be able to do it. The fourth bullet here refers to the fact that this course has theory and it has to include the application of theory, current issues that are related to sports ethical lapses. And a fifth area that really deals not so much with the teaching of the course, but getting a course approved, is that you might have a situation where some units think this is our turf. The philosophy department might say, you shouldn't be teaching this in sport communication. We should be teaching it. Someone in sport communication might not want somebody in sport management to teach it because they think they don't have the expertise. This is avoidable. You can address it. I should say this is something that can be addressed, but it sometimes surfaces when you're trying to get courses approved. What should be in a course called sports ethics? I think initially you want to include what are the obstacles that make it difficult for people to make ethical decisions in sports. And one of the obstacles is what we call the normalization of deviance. Something is done so often that people think it must be ethical simply because it's been normalized. There's a tendency for people to rationalize unethical behavior. Hey, we're fighting fire with fire here. We're just doing what the other guys are doing. Or this is a one-off. We'll never do this again. Sometimes people identify the legality of something and assume that because something is illegal, it must be ethical. There are issues that relate to financial pressures. Look, we have to do this because otherwise we won't be able to survive. We have to beat another school in order to recruit well. So I think there are obstacles to making ethical decisions in sports, and they should be addressed. In addition, you have to include in this course some ethical tools. Now, there are informal tools and there are formal tools. Maybe several people who are attending this webinar today are familiar with both informal and formal ones, but take the mom test, the simple test of, if I did this, would I be comfortable telling my mother that I did it? And if it doesn't pass the mom test, it's probably unethical. If I did this, would I be concerned if the New York Times had this as a headline? If I would be concerned, it's probably unethical. If it kind of smells funny, but it's probably unethical. But there are formal tools also that have to be presented. The categorical imperative, the greatest happiness principle, often called utilitarianism, Fletcher's situation ethics, contrasted with what has become situational ethics, and the golden rule. These are tools that ought to be included in this class. You might not want to dwell on it, but at least in a book that is a companion text for a course in sports ethics, you should identify certain theories that are germane to the study of sports ethics. virtue theory, media framing and agenda setting theory. Again, there are some instructors who might not want to dwell on theory, but I think it can be interesting and valuable to discuss certain theories that are germane to the study of sports ethics. It is essential in a course like this to identify contemporary examples. So a student can see, oh, I see the relevance of this. In today's sports landscape, we have a situation where gambling has been promoted by the NBA, by Major League Baseball, by the NFL. Well, if you promote gambling, you're likely to increase the chances of people doing things that are unattractive, are inappropriate for a sporting event. So there have been issues of point shaving. A player might be approached by a gambler to shave points in a match. You have issues of doping, taking illicit drugs to enhance performance. Just this past weekend, we had a situation where teams were considering tanking in the NFL, considering tanking in order to get a better draft choice. You have the situation of double standards with female journalists often sidelined, literally and figuratively, in sporting events. They become sideline reporters and are not given an opportunity to be in the booth in the same way men are. And also, sometimes people say, hey, are the women journalists being evaluated on different criteria than the male journalists? We had a situation in the Ryder Cup just this past fall where fans were deriding opponents in a way that many would say is unethical, at least unattractive. You often have the situation of the lying to recruits. The transfer portal just opened. Will you lie to recruits who you might want to come to your university to play for you? And I think that a course like this ought to include contemporary examples. I think, and when I developed this course and when I taught it for the special topics course, it has to have in-class exercises. You want to have debates where people present both sides of an issue. So, for example, you're considering playing a quarterback who has just been accused of something unattractive. They've stolen or they've committed domestic violence. You're not going to win the game if you don't play your quarterback. Can you justify playing the quarterback? And have the students debate both sides of an issue. You'd want to have, I think it's a good idea to have individual pre-class cases. I didn't say that quite well. Before the class starts, you want to present a case by sending out an agenda ahead of time, which requires students to think about how they might react in the beginning of a course. Sometimes decisions in sports organizations are done in groups. You want to have an exercise that requires a group to analyze a situation and present it. There's no shortage of panel shows where a host throws a question out to panelists and they opine, whether or not they're indeed pundits or not, about the particular issues. And you want to simulate that in a class. So I think the course ought to include these examples. Okay, so what are the challenges for a companion text? One, the content has to be accessible. You write about the categorical imperative, you have to digest it. Think of the audience as intelligent, industrious readers, but not necessarily people who are steeped in philosophy. You've got to write that book for that audience. You've got to recognize the heterogeneous nature of the audience. I mentioned before that you have different kinds of students that take the course. The text ought to recognize the fact that you have this heterogeneity. The cases you present that are sports cases, you want the students to be able to engage in. And how do you do that? You try to pick cases that they may have experienced themselves. Do you call a ball out when it's in, when you're playing a tennis match? If your opponent has previously always called the balls that you've hit in out. Well, many students have probably experienced that. Now, you'd want to have these cases for analysis that students can relate to. The book can't be a Sunday school reader. You're not proselytizing. You're not telling people how to act. You're trying to expose them to issues that are germane to sports ethical challenges, and they have to consider how they're reacting. But you don't want it to seem as if this is what you should do, this is Sunday school. I think it's very important to recognize realities. Some books that I've read indicate that We'd all be more ethical in sports contexts if there wasn't such a pressure to win, if people weren't so competitive, if they enjoyed sport for the nature of the game. Well, maybe, but it's not going to happen. On this past weekend, when the Baltimore Ravens lost to the Steelers on a missed field goal at the end of the game, the Ravens were despondent. The Steelers were jubilant. The Ravens didn't say, well, I'm very happy. We played a great game and it was real fun. It's not going to happen. That you've got to realize the realities about competition. That doesn't mean you cheat in order to win, but you have to recognize that there is a desire to win. You also have to recognize that there are financial pressures on institutions. And you cannot make assumptions about the right thing or the wrong thing to do on the basis of whether or not, without regard to the financial pressures of an institution. The next to last bullet on this slide, this book has to be made comfortable for instructors as well as students. You're going to have people teaching this course who've never taught it before. The people who are teaching this course have to be comfortable with the way it's presented. And I mentioned that it ought to have a healthy mix, that this course would have a healthy mix of theory and application. That doesn't mean that every instructor will use a lot of theory, but the book ought to have that theory available. All right. Now, this is going to sound a bit like an advertisement, and I feel a little reluctant about doing so, but I think the book that I've written does include obstacles, ethical tools, germane theories, and something that I didn't mention previously in the webinar, a section that deals with what happens when there has been an ethical lapse that's created a crisis for an organization. How do you react to that? So there are chapters on all of these areas. There are multiple examples. There are 7 chapters in the book. In chapters 1 through 5 and chapter 7, there are at least 11 exercises. So that's 66 exercises in chapters 1 through 5 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 is totally dedicated to cases, 28 of them. So that you have 94. And then in chapter 1, because it's the introductory chapter, I introduced 6 additional cases. So there are 100 different cases in here. If all you wanted to do as an instructor was make this a discussion class, and that may work for the nature of the course or the nature of the population that's going to take that course, there are many examples in here that would allow you and the students to engage in discussion based on actual situations, or some cases, the exercises are hypothetical as opposed to ones that really happen. But the hypothetical ones are based on real ones. There are recurring features in this book that deal with gender equity. The feature is called gender equity marginalization. And they all deal with whether or not women are treated equitably and the ethical issues that are relate to not being treated equitably. Right? You have a situation, a regular feature that talks about making presentations in like a press conference simulation. There's an exercise that's called Bring It On. It assumes that you're a panel show and you've got a host that makes an opinion, takes a stance, and the panelists have to opine about whether or not they agree or disagree with that stance. There's a recurring feature that deals with groups and how a group must address an ethical issue and present. And there's one called Both Sides Now. And that regular feature asks students to come into a class knowledgeable about a particular case without knowing which side of the case they're going to have to debate and support. And this requires people to look at the other perspective on an ethical issue. The book allows instructors flexibility. If you're the kind of person who wants to mix theory and practice, it's there for you. If you're the kind of person who and you have a class that's made up of individuals who would really enjoy and find valuable discussion more than theory, you can do that. So it allows a great deal of flexibility. I wrote the instructor's manual and the test bank. Kendall Hunt is doing the PowerPoint. But when I wrote the instructor's manual, my idea was write this so that a novice instructor could, if she or he wanted to, follow this and teach the course from that manual. and therefore it's essentially a turnkey. Most instructors want to bring their particular flavor, special sauce to a course, but if you wanted to, you could use that instructor's manual to walk you through the course. So, in sum, again, thank you for attending this webinar. I think this is an important subject as opposed to my brother-in-law's comment that these two words don't go together. I think they do go together. And in the course, any course in program in sports management or sport communication, I think you ought to have a course in sports ethics. It ought to include certain principles that I've enumerated. What are the obstacles? What are the tools? What's relevant theory? And how do you apply this theory to practice? And you should have, in a course like this, real-world, relatable examples. And I think the book, Sports Ethics Challenges for Athletes and Management, as difficult as it is for me to be dispassionate about it, would address the issues that are related to teaching a course called Sports Ethics. And I think, and I hope if you are considering teaching this course or you've assigned teaching this course, you'll consider the book. And now, Nikki, I'm glad to take questions that might have surfaced during the course of this webinar. And again, I thank you very much for attending.
Again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the chat or Q&A functions in Zoom. We did have a few come up during the webinar. Alan, you've had this course before, you've run it, you've made the book. Do you have any advice for professors that are also looking at teaching sports ethics, like items that worked in your classroom that might work well in others?
Yes, I do have some suggestions. What seems to work for me is before a class, sending out an agenda that includes a couple of prompts and requiring that students be able to discuss those prompts in the beginning of a class. I do what's called cold calling, but it's like cold calling light. That is, I'll begin the class by saying, all right, this prompt that dealt with whether or not an athletic director should hire a coach who has been successful other places but has broken the rules. How do you feel about this case? And what I will do is see if students raise their hand, but if they don't, cold call. And I say it's more like a lukewarm call because I don't make people feel uncomfortable, but I say if you don't answer it, I'll come back to you and ask somebody else. But I think a prompt ahead of time and the idea the students becoming aware of the fact that they will be called on during the course of the class to opine, not necessarily to regurgitate what the greatest happiness principle is or what situation ethics is, but rather to opine on a particular subject. So I think ahead of time, these prompts are very valuable.
We had a question come in. What are some of the reactions or opinions from students who have taken your course? Did they find value in the sports ethics course as part of their sports management curriculum?
I taught the course one time as a special topics course for honor students. And I'm very happy that the reactions were very positive. Often the responses were, I didn't realize what was entailed in this course, but I found the interaction valuable. So I think the interactivity is a key to the success. When I've taught a section of sport communication that had sports ethics, again, the response is certainly not that they always agree that there is one right answer and one wrong answer, and I don't think there's a right answer and a wrong answer in these cases, but that they enjoyed the opportunity to reflect on various ethical issues in sports, even if they might come down with the side of, I'm going to do what's unethical because I need to do it in order to save my job. So in the past, again, I taught it one time as a whole course. It's been developed as a whole course, but not yet taught. And in the time that I taught it as a honor section, the reaction was, boy, this is surprising. I didn't know what was involved, and I'm really glad I got an opportunity to share my ideas.
Another question has come in. Aside from the exercises and participation, what are the types of graded assessments you have implemented in your text?
Okay, there are two in the text. or in the
In your
course.
course. Yep,
Okay.
in your
In the
course.
course, what I do is I have an exam about midterm one in the midterm. And in this exam, what I'm asking students to do is to be able to describe some of the principles and theories that are related, the tools that are related to sports ethics. And in that test, they will explain what the categorical imperative is, and then apply it to a particular case. Usually, what I've done, or what I did when I taught it in the honors course, is I present a case that we've already discussed in class. So now they have an opportunity in written form to not only to address what they might have discussed orally in class, but apply a principle. Explain to me why you made this decision and on what basis did you make this decision. For example, in the book, I have this case that's dealing with buy games. Uh, they buy games when you pay a school, an inferior school, to come play at your school, pay them money to come and lose. Well, essentially to pay and lose. And I ask students to evaluate whether or not they would do that, either accept the money or pay out, and what principle they would use. Are they using the categorical imperative? Are they using the greatest happiness principle? So they have to apply um, a tool to a particular case. So it's a long answer to your short question. I have a midterm examination in that class, which requires students to identify uh, and explain certain principles and then apply the principles.
Okay. I think one last question here. You had mentioned, you have students come ready to discuss both sides of the argument, and they don't really know what they're going to be arguing during their debate. What do you do with topics that have a similar, like a gray area where there's not really a right decision, there's not really a wrong decision, and it could be because it's normalized or the legality of it? How do you handle those discussions in class?
Well, students can present whatever opinion they want, and that opinion could be it's great. It's not black and white. Their opinion could be, look, I'm going to argue that we should not hire a coach that's been a miscreant. I'm going to argue that we should not hire a coach that has been successful but has broken the rules. However, I would be amenable to hiring this coach if we have put in place a panel that's going to be evaluating this coach on a yearly basis so that we have put in a safeguard. Now, people might roll their eyes and think this safeguard is just superficial, but I would allow students to present an option that is not a black and white option.
Okay. Let me just double check, make sure we got all the questions answered here. Yes, we've hit all of the questions.
So let me just end by saying, if anybody who's out there who's attended thinks of a question subsequently, I'm glad, write to me. Is my email on the slides, Nikki?
No, it is not.
Okay,
Um,
it's fine with me if that you share that information. And if
okay.
people want to contact me individually, I'm glad to. And what I say with all of my books with Kendall Hunt and anywhere, um, I don't mind being a guest speaker. So if you want to invite me to a class that you're teaching to speak on a subject that's germane to your class, I really don't mind, assuming that we can work out the times, for me to zoom in and speak. And I've done it on a number of occasions, I think successfully. So please don't be shy about contacting me or asking me if to participate in a class.
Sounds good. In the next few days, you'll receive a recording of this webinar along with Alan's contact information and a link to the book if you would like to check it out. We really appreciate you guys attending the webinar today. And yeah, Alan, do you want to say anything else before we close it out today?
Just to restate what you have said, thank you for taking time out of your day. I hope you found it valuable, and I'm glad to elaborate if there's something that I didn't touch and didn't come out during Q&A.
All right. Well, have a good Wednesday, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.